2020 is a write-off. 2021, we're going to have a lot more film productions as per the trades, which means that 2022 will be a fruitful year. Kevin Jagernauth, this week we got news that two major auteur filmmakers are going to be going into production, knock on wood, for 2021. So let's dive into the top of this pairing, which is Nuri Bilge Ceylan. He's going to film.
So a whole bunch of news coming out of Arte France cinema production company. They've got a trio of films they're throwing some weight behind, and we're going to talk about some more films that are being produced as well. But for these ones, Nuri Bilge Ceylan, he's getting to work on his next feature, and it's been, he usually works at a new film every 3 to 4 years, so it sounds like this is about the right time for him. And it's just good to know that he's got a new film in the works. We know that it will be about a film centering on two teachers in Anatolia, one of the director's favorite settings for his films, who's just looking to escape his grim life, and then he meets another teacher like himself, and then they forge a connection. So this is a film that I think every cinephile is gonna keep on their brackets for Cannes 2020.
2022.
Yes, 2022. You're right.
It's another portrait of the familiar rural exodus where youth is ultimately they have dismal chances and they look towards the big city to sort of like have a career, have a life, and so this is going to go into in a very much blues setting, and I can imagine these characters are going to sort of like solemn, so sort of like what we saw in The Wild Pear Tree. Now, as you mentioned, for Ceylan, his pace is very much every 3 or 4 years. He really takes the time to write out his smaller character set, but as well as match the sort of like corresponding backdrop to something that has an actual storyline. I quite liked The Wild Pear Tree. It was one of the last entries for the 2018 Cannes edition. I was looking at the trio of actors, not really familiar to me, or perhaps they're probably not familiar to international audiences, but again, you get a sense of there's that connection between a certain like despair and hopelessness that unfortunately the rural setting affords, or sort of like puts a roadblock in these characters' pathway.
Yeah, this story of a teacher hoping to get a transfer to Istanbul, which is basically the crux of this story. It's funny, it actually brings to mind Lucretia Martel's recent film Zama, which is also about a functional, in that film it's a bureaucrat also waiting to get transferred, and kind of losing his mind in the process. So it'll be interesting to see how he tackles this sort of the sort of mental aspect of it, this constant waiting and anticipation, and having that, I guess, weigh on you as a person. And particularly during now in a pandemic where I think we're all waiting for our opportunities to go to the places and do the things we normally can and are unable to. So it'll be interesting to see how that theme kind of resonates a bit.
Yeah. Fans of slow cinema and a very methodical approach will appreciate this film and everything in his filmography. I highly recommend checking his works out. For Mia Hansen-Løve, she's also moving towards something that sounds like despair a little bit, and a very taxing, emotionally wrought, possibly drama. So again, financed by Olivier Pierre, Art Cine. This is called Our Beau Matin. It's our 8th feature, and it'll be shooting in summer of next year. And we have Léa Seydoux, Pascal Gregory, who we know from the Romero films. I actually quite enjoyed him in a movie called Three Adventures of Brooke, which was sort of like on the radar, but it played extremely well in the film festival circuit. Nicole Garcia, who's a filmmaker in her own right, and Melville Poupard, who had a sort of like career resurgence with Ozon's film, The Grace of God. So she's got this quartet in place, and visits are really a terrain that perhaps closer in sentiment to The Father, My Children, sort of like a weighty drama. So yeah, first of all, let's talk about Bergman Island, the fact that we haven't seen it so far this year, and what 2021 looks like for her, and perhaps let's dig into the plot line here.
Sure. So, as we both know, she already has a film in the can with Bergman Island. And I think we both expected it to appear somewhere in the fall circuit after missing out on being a Cannes selection, and it wasn't anywhere. It wasn't in Venice. It wasn't in the TIFF lineup or New York. So that's a bit surprising to me. It makes me think that perhaps they're hoping to get into the Cannes berth for next year, or maybe Berlin. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. And as for this film, in Beau Matin, it's an interesting and kind of timely story about a woman caring for her father who's suffering from a neurological disease and trying to find care for him. And I think particularly as we saw this year around the world, I mean, we both saw it in Quebec and we've seen it in other places as well, how the sort of neglect that people in care homes received caused them to, caused a wave of deaths, really tragic around the world. And so I wonder if, again, like it's touching on something that we're all thinking about at the moment.
Yeah, it really is a global concern. Seeing that a lot of Western civilization, like a lot of Western societies, we tend to place our loved ones in these sort of like settings, and there's an infrastructure there that simply isn't working. So I think this is going to touch upon a lot of that strain that can exist on somebody who's trying to like have their own life, and they're it's difficult to look towards the future when you have somebody to take care of that's not your children. And so yeah, it should be a touching portrait, and I think harkens back to that earlier work that I had mentioned that also played at Cannes. As for Bergman Island, you're probably right with the Berlin Film Festival being the legit location. She did premiere The Future there with Isabelle Huppert, I believe. That's at least 5-6 years ago. And for me, that was her best. That's her best work to date. And so I wouldn't be surprised if they hit Berlin and sort of like take out Cannes 2021 out of the equation. Speaking about Cannes, Wes Anderson might be a rare film to be invited for 2 years in a row. And obviously he's got the itch and he wants to start working again. So, these little pieces of news bits that we find, Jordan Rupp at the film stage for like put all the puzzle pieces together. So yeah, Wes Anderson's at it again. So what do you think about him potentially shoring up at the Cannes Film Festival for a second time out?
Yeah, I mean, we should add that this is not confirmed. It's really some educated guesswork.
Yes.
A bit of the fact that Disney released their release dates for the next couple of years, and French Dispatch was curiously absent. So it's leading to a lot of speculation that that Wes Anderson's holding the film to debut in the Croisette next spring, and it makes sense. I mean, it was a selection this year. It was shot in France. It has a tremendous, has a French cast. I mean, it's a no-brainer. So that makes sense. But on top of that, we have news that he's getting ready to shoot his next film, which for Wes Anderson, he's not like he takes a long time between films, but this
Mhm.
is for him essentially back to back. And as you said, it's a lot of information being pulled from different places that are putting this together.
So yeah, this one's apparently set in Rome, Italy, and I was thinking that for Wes, there might be like we might look back at his work filmography and say, well, these were the European years, sort of like how Woody Allen found a lot of coin or funding possibilities at this juncture in his life, at least from the French money, Spanish money, and I get a feeling that seeing that he's already European in a way because he resides in France, it sort of like makes sense that he wants to play with different backdrops that are literally right next door to him. So um, what was interesting is sort of like again seeing all these pieces being put together about his appreciation for Italian cinema, the Fellinis, the Antonionis, and obviously if we look at his treasure trove of films, we find a lot of those influences there. So um, yeah, curiously, this is supposed to be a romantic film, but again, we have very little to go on. Might include some stop motion animation sequences. Who knows at this point? But yeah, Italian.
Yeah, I mean, it could be interesting. I mean, yeah, the information is really scant. Like, it might have a romance, but like all of his films have some sort of romantic element. And Wes Anderson's a cinephile. He loves European cinema. He's a as you mentioned, he's really into auteurs like Fellini and whatnot. And a few years ago, he had mentioned that he was looking at doing a film that was sort of inspired by De Sica's The Gold of Naples,
Mhm.
which would be sort of an anthology piece. So maybe he's revisiting that. Um, but again, we don't know. All we do know is that he's gearing up to shoot a film, and that's pretty exciting. And I would imagine this downtime, as he waits for French Dispatch to premiere, maybe he just banged out another script. So that's pretty great.
Wong Kar-Wai appears to be in some creative overdrive. I don't know if there's like some political aspect to, the Hong Kong being sort of like I don't know, creatively in jeopardy. But yeah, I mean, we're getting blossoms, we're getting a whole bunch of cool stuff at the New York Film Fest. We're going to get some 4K editions of In the Mood for Love, and now we're getting Chungking Express Part Two. So yeah, I mean, there's so much to talk about with this project. I think one thing that's interesting is how these Asian auteurs um, we'll speak about Wong Kar Wai specifically. How there's this need to sort of like not only revisit themes but revisit these characters that he's created and sort of like look at a landscape in the far distant future and see how those conditions sort of like enhance or take these relationships and sort of like expose them in a different mindscape. Yeah, what do you think about him? Just the 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 sort of like creative overdrive that he's in as we speak.
Yeah, I mean, who can say what's fueling it? But as you say, he's in a period where a couple things are happening. Yes, he has Blossoms in development, so that will be a TV series and a feature film as well. Um, and I think maybe the prospect of going back and looking at In the Mood for Love, which we both know is coming in a new restoration as well, maybe just had him revisiting his old work in general. And so out of that, we have this proposed Chungking Express sequel, if you will, which will revisit the characters and themes but it's not unusual. I mean, he made 2046, which is in many ways was a spiritual sequel to In the Mood for Love. So I think we can expect something in that vein. And I think we have a filmmaker who, much like, if we want to compare him to American filmmakers broadly, much like Terrence Malick or David Lynch, has just sort of like found that creative spark again, and it's just like forging ahead. David Lynch revisited Twin Peaks, a couple decades later. Terrence Malick has just been, I mean, we both know he has a film in post right now, and God knows he probably has like another 15 scripts in his drawer waiting to be made. So it's exciting. I think it'll be a very welcome voice back on the art house circuit.
Yeah, this decade might be a Wong Kar-Wai renaissance in a way, but those are really good comparison points. And as we know, the original shot released in the 90s, I think it was 94. Looks at these two police officers, and so we might be revisiting those characters, and yeah, I mean, there's a lot to go on here, but essentially we'd be revisiting the Chinese city of Chungking. Jacques Audiard, Céline Sciamma, Léa Myzus are collaborating together for a film called Les Olympiades, which means the Olympians. They are actually shooting as we speak, and I sort of like navigated. I checked on the web to see if there was any. There's no casting announcements mentioned so far, but I was curious to see if there would be anything that shored up, which was not the case. But I was looking at the source material, and obviously the addition of these two strong female auteurs says a lot about the direction that he wants to move in with Les Olympiades. So what do you make of all these elements?
It is exciting. Jacques Audiard, he is never one to make, he is always moving in a different direction than expected. His last film was a straight up Western. And this film is really interesting because the background of it is that it's based on a graphic novel by Adrian Tomine, who's a very American graphic novelist. I've read some of his stuff. He's had his work featured on the cover of the New Yorker. He's done like record albums, designs, and things like that. And his viewpoint is very. He really gets into themes of like alienation and disconnection and things like that. So it's a really interesting material for Jacques Audiard to play with. Who usually, at least in his films, is playing with very big, kind of broad emotions. Where Adrian Tomine generally is a lot more insular. So that's one element, and I think for me, that it's really exciting that Céline Sciamma is doing this screenplay. As you know, she's coming off in just a tremendous year with Portrait of a Lady on Fire. But what people tend to forget is she does have her own sort of like screenwriting background.
Yeah.
Probably most notably with My Life as a Zucchini previously, which was a remarkable animated film. So it's a pretty cool meeting of the minds. I'm very curious to see what this collaboration looks like, because on paper, these are two very different kinds of filmmakers.
And I'm quite actually interested in the other writer. So essentially, we're getting the idea that it's going to focus on young people. It's going to focus on a young female protagonist, and sort of like it says adolescence, and if we reference potentially, so it's based on a book of short stories, and that one sort of like looked at parenthood and mortality. I don't know how it's going to transfer here, but as you know, Sciamma also did the movie Girlhood, and for Léa Myzus, she did a movie called Ava with Naomi Abitsi, and that was featured at the Critics Week, and for me that was just a breath of fresh air. It captured lightning in a bottle, a free spirit, and sort of like the language that this filmmaker used to portray this young adult in sort of like her growing pain rituals, but also her first romance. I thought it was a really original take. And this filmmaker slash screenwriter was actually working on her second feature before the COVID hit. So I'm not certain where her sophomore feature film went. But what I do know is that the youthful exuberance that we find in Ava matched with Siama, that language that's going to appear on the screenplay is going to be a lot for Audiard to work with. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to seeing who he cast. Did he go for non-actors perhaps? But yeah, just it's revisiting sort of like the cityscape that he feels most comfortable with, and obviously Portraits of a Prophet and Depan to an extent, and yeah, there appears to be a lot of cool things working here. But as you said, this is a second adaptation from English novel, which is kind of quite interesting in itself.
Yeah, and so I just want to circle back. Everything you said is right on. I think it's just a really cool trio of talent, really, to bring this to life. And the work that it's based on is called Killing and Dying, and it's actually 6 interconnected stories. So knowing that how Audiard likes to change genres and test himself, maybe this is his like attempt to do something like Altman-esque or whatnot. And the film is in production, as you mentioned, right now. So could this be yet another film that Thierry is going to have at his disposal for Cannes? I mean, I'm sure those conversations are happening, and we're talking. I mean, when we're going to have to do an episode about next year's potential titles for Cannes, and it's just going to be a list of like, top tier films, like, and this is going to be another one I think we're going to have to consider to be in the mix.
Yeah, there must be 5, 6, 7 features. I mean, we got Taijo, we got Verhoeven, we have the filmmaker
Wes Anderson,
William Motors. I mean, there's just so many. Dumont. Those films have benefited from the most post-production time, perhaps in a lot of these people's careers. So those films are just going to be more than ready. So. Yeah, Audiard is most likely going to be added to that lineup. He's filming now. This thing is wrapped up in 2 months, and he's got a wet print ready to go in the month of April. So if we have a 2021 version of edition of Cannes, for certain this is in that talk. Lady Macbeth Helmer, William Oldroyd, has partnered with Amazon on a project called The Jealousy Man. And I'm sort of like, I took a step back because it's based on an author that I didn't really think as a sophomore feature would latch onto. So what are you thinking about sort of like this art house? He's had one, Oldroyd had one of those major breakouts that all these first-time filmmakers dream about. And I just think it's a really curious pick as a sophomore film.
Yeah, so as we both know, William Oldroyd broke out after a few shorts with Lady Macbeth, which was just a phenomenal film, and also launched Florence Pugh into a massive career. And then he kind of went quiet. I mean, it's been 4 years since that film. He's had a couple things in development, which I'll get to after, but you're right. So this film is an adaptation of a book by Joe Nesbo, which is interesting because he is, he's a mystery writer. He's, infamously the author behind the much reviled and memed The Snowman. This new film is The Jealousy Man, which will, a detective story about a detective who gets involved in a love triangle. But yeah, Joe Nesbo, he's an airport kind of mystery writer. You can grab when you're jumping onto a plane, but not one I would expect someone who made Lady to sort of dive into. But there's always that thing of directors who break out, who kind of make a shift toward doing something that maybe has a bit more broad appeal, or let them sort of play with a bit more of a budget. So maybe this is that project, but you're right, it is very surprising.
So essentially, the story is going to be adapted by Roberto Benton Vegna. And this is set on a remote Greek island, and it follows a story of twin brothers caught in a violent love triangle, and a detective known as Jealousy Man is called in to investigate. We're talking about a Romanian film just before we hopped on here called The Whistler. The Whistler. And so it's sort of like, it reminds me of this film in a way. But yeah, William Oldroyd had another picture that sort of like sounds more or less along the same lines as this, like a little gangster angle, perhaps. So he was essentially supposed to do Body Cross, which was being coined as a Eastern Promises sequel, and was set up with Focus Features. I almost want to say that would have been the better of the two projects.
He also had a couple years ago, he had set up over at Channel 4 a mini series called Chimerica, which
Okay.
was based on a play, and it was about U.S.-China relations. The story kicks off in 1989 with the Tiananmen Square incident, and then follows up in 2012 with the U.S. election. And that was a project that was set up and then never heard about it again. So it seems that in this time, he's certainly been trying to get stuff off the ground, but hasn't happened. And again, like Joe Nesbo, I'm sure it's a thing that gets easy financing and lets him make something. So, but I mean, all cynicism aside, he's an exciting filmmaker, and if he has a cool way to take on this genre material, then that's really exciting, and then that's cool. So I'm keeping optimism, because he's a really cool voice, and certainly showed a lot of filmmaking like panache, I would say, with Lady Macbeth.
Well said, well said. And yeah, I'll give him a shot as well, because I was a huge fan of Lady Macbeth. Bradley Cooper, who is currently on the set of Paul Thomas Anderson, is going to set himself up for a shoot in 2021 where he's behind the camera, in front of the camera. And it's an interesting biopic. Again, it falls within a larger musical landscape, and he brings along one of the better actresses out there. So the film is called Maestro, and he's brought Carey Mulligan on board, and a little bit more investigating into these true life figures showed two really different creatures, if you will, and how is it going to assess that relationship is going to be. I think is going to be an interesting point. So let's dive into this Maestro biopic.
Sure.
Biopic.
So this is a film that has been in development for a while. It was actually set up at Paramount for a while, and then Netflix swooped in with their giant suitcases of money and grabbed it. But this is about the legendary Leonard Bernstein composer. It's going to span 3 decades, so it's going to be an epic story. It has, Josh Singer of Spotlight fame with the script, Bradley Cooper playing the lead role, and yeah, Carey Mulligan stepping in. And it's really cool to see Bradley Cooper emerge as a filmmaker. He is, I think anyone who sort of followed him a little bit outside of his movie roles knows that he is a student of film. He loves talking about film. He loves talking about the craft. So this is another big step for him in a project that for a while had some competition. For a while, Jake Gyllenhaal had his own Leonard Bernstein film that had Cary Fukunaga attached to direct, but I would assume that that's no longer the case. I mean, just given the steam that this project is taking, I think that one is left in the dust.
You're correct on that. So Leonard Bernstein was an orchestra chef, and his take on classical music was to sort of like give it a different, um, I want to say almost urban cityscape American vibe to it. So he's prolific on different levels. He wrote the score for On the Waterfront, and Carey Mulligan will play the wife character. So again, if we're touching upon 3 decades, that means we're going to get the aged in process. Um, but her character of Felicia is quite interesting. How she was really proactive and a militant, and um, sort of took on social injustices, and sort of like took her privilege and utilized it so that she can help out those that needed a voice. And so what I'm curious about is how the complexity of the actual screenplay, and how we're going to essentially focus on not one but two characters and making it a double biopic. I'm getting a sense that we might see this here.
Yeah, I mean, I think you span 3 decades. You're going to get into a lot of stuff to talk about. So you're right. This could be two characters that are really investigated in great detail. And it should be said that Leonard Bernstein really brought, kind of classical music. I don't want to say to the mainstream, but he was almost like a household name in a way that most composers or conductors aren't really known. So there's that element of it too. There's an element of celebrity as well. So it's a fascinating story. It's a fascinating subject. Um, and I mean, Bradley Cooper, Carey Mulligan, it's a great duo. And they both have films on the horizon too. As you mentioned, Paul Thomas Anderson's film for Cooper, and Promising Young Women for Carey Mulligan, which was sidelined by the pandemic and still is without a release date. So they'll both be going into this film with a couple films to sort of like fill in the gap before we see this one.
Yeah. And it'll be fun to, in the case of Maestro, it'll be fun to see, like perhaps it'll be the meeting point where they meet in 46 will then breed, like those next 3 decades are, I mean, for me, it's fun to see the 50s, 60s, 70s in cinema. So yeah, production design should be through the roof for that. We conclude with a project that has a lot of interesting elements in terms of people that are in really good place in their filmographies. So Universal Pictures outbid some huge competitors, including Netflix, for a drama about a stunt type world, I believe. And the filmmaker is essentially that's gonna be not his next project, but the project after. The screenwriter sort of has a lineage to him, and the actor sort of has a lineage to these type of roles. So let's delve into this Untitled Universal Pictures project directed by David Leitch.
Yeah, so we have Ryan Gosling putting on the stuntman uniform again after Drive and Place Beyond the Pines for this untitled film that will portray the life of a stuntman. So it's an interesting move. It's interesting in that Ryan Gosling, he was once the sort of like indie darling, working with Terrence Malick and Damien Chazelle and Nicholas Winding Refn, but he's recently just pivoting right to studio projects. He's got Wolfman also at Universal in development. He's got The Gray Man over at Paramount, a spy film that was once in the hands of James Gray. Yep. So, and now he's got this film, which David Leitch, he's not a filmmaker we usually we would ever talk about on this podcast, but or this on the show. But he's behind John Wick and Atomic Blonde and Deadpool 2. So it's just it's an interesting mix. I think we can both say that Ryan Gosling's an actor we like to watch. We really enjoy his work, but this will be you and me at the not at Cannes, but at the Cineplex watching this when it opens.
Yeah, it's definitely a popcorn muncher type adventure. I'm quite a fan of a movie called The Stuntman, which was a film with, is it Peter Sellers? No, sorry. Oh, I forgot that.
Peter Fonda.
No. Sorry, I have his image.
Peter O'Toole.
Peter O'Toole. There you go.
Yeah.
I quite enjoy this film. Again, it's one of those films about filmmaking. I think here it's not going to be anywhere close to that, but we are going to fall into those worlds where professional life and probably personal life intermix. More or less something that we've seen already in Drive, especially at the onset, where we really get into Gosling's character and his world, and how he makes a living. But yeah, it's kind of it's interesting how he's taking less roles, he's taking bigger paychecks, and sort of like the indie world and the reffin world are like it's in the rear view mirror for him. So curious role choices, but as the trades mentioned, perhaps there really is for him an interesting world that he sort of wants to revisit from different spectrums.
Yeah, it could be. And also, I think stunt people are having an interesting moment right now in the sense of, I think there's, over the past couple of years, I keep hearing like, a lot of calls for stunt people to get recognized at the Oscars. And I mean, last year we had Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, with Brad Pitt playing a stuntman, and sort of bringing that sort of personality and ego and thing to life. So it'll be interesting to see how this film kind of plays on that sentiment that's sort of bubbling up. I think there's a lot of sympathy or a lot of understanding towards that kind of work that there maybe hasn't been before.
And continuing along with the Brad Pitt connection is that David Leitch is actually in pre-production with a huge Columbia Pictures project, Bullet Train. So there's that little connection there. But yeah, we're unlikely to see this anytime soon. I'm thinking 2023, especially if it's a larger 50, 60, $80 million project. So yeah, we won't be hearing about this for a little while, but yeah, we'll see where it goes. I'm Eric Lavallée. I'm editor-in-chief and site owner for IONCINEMA.com. And this is
Kevin Jagernauth, contributing writer for the playlist.
And together we are IndieSponge. I'm Eric Lavallée. I'm editor-in-chief and site owner for IONCINEMA.com. And this is
Kevin Jagernauth, contributing writer for the playlist.
And together we are IndieSponge.